The Grand Pine Bank stood as a monument of polished oak and gleaming brass, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the clink of coins and the hushed murmurs of wealthy patrons. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns over the marble floors. It was a place of order, wealth, and unspoken rules that everyone in the bustling town of Blackwood Hollow knew better than to break. Behind the counter, Myra the rabbit adjusted her emerald green vest, her ears twitching as she sorted a stack of gold certificates. She was used to the bank's rhythm, the rustle of paperwork, the occasional whine of a dissatisfied customer, the arrogant swagger of Felix the Fox, the bank's ever-smirking manager. What she wasn't used to was him. The arrival. The bank's heavy oak doors creaked open, and a hush fell over the lobby. A figure stood silhouetted against the midday sun, an old raccoon, his fur more silver than black, his spine curved with age. His clothes were a patchwork of faded fabrics, his paws gnarled like ancient tree roots. And slung over his shoulder was a tattered burlap sack, its contents lumpy and shifting with every slow, deliberate step he took. Myra's nose twitched. Odd. Most of their clients were sleek-furred merchants or well-dressed landowners, not this. Whispers rippled through the line. Look at that sack, probably full of trash. Does he think this is a charity house? Someone call security before he stinks up the place. The raccoon ignored them all. His clouded eyes, one a milky blue, the other a sharp, calculating black, scanned the room before landing on Myra. The claim. He shuffled forward, the sack thudding against the floor as he reached the counter. Up close, Myra caught the scent of old parchment, damp earth, and something metallic like rust or gold. I'm here to claim what's mine, he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, as if unused for decades. Myra forced a polite smile. Of course, sir. Do you have an account with us? The raccoon's lips peeled back in what might have been a grin or a snarl. Better. I own this bank. Silence. Then laughter. A snort from a boar in line. A giggle from the lynx teller next to her. Even Myra's own shoulders shook until she saw the look in the old raccoon's eyes. He wasn't joking. The manager's intervention. Felix the Fox emerged from his office, his tailored suit immaculate, his tail flicking with amusement. Problem here. Myra gestured weakly. This gentleman claims he, owns the bank. Felix's smirk widened. Does he now? He leaned on the counter, towering over the raccoon. And where's your proof, old-timer? A D-Day contract or just delusions? The raccoon didn't flinch. He simply reached into his sack. The room held its breath. The first reveal. What he pulled out wasn't gold. Not yet. It was a single, rusted key, its teeth worn but its shape unmistakable, a match for the bank's original vault designs. Felix's ear twitched. Where do you steal that? The raccoon ignored him, dropping the key onto the counter with a clank. Then, with agonizing slowness, he reached back into the sack and dumped a century's worth of history onto the marble. Parchments. Sealed wills. Ledgers so old the ink had bled into ghosts of words. And at the very top, a document stamped with the bank's original crest, its wax seal still intact. Myra's paws trembled as she unfolded it. Transfer of ownership, it read, from Elias Blackwood to Raccoon, in perpetuity. Dated 120 years ago. Felix's laughter died in his throat. The weight of the past. The raccoon's voice was soft but carried like a blade. You've been charging me fees, to store my gold, in my vault. His milky eye gleamed. Now. Shall we discuss repayments? The air turned to ice. Because in Blackwood Hollow, debts were never forgiven, and this old raccoon had just called in the oldest one of all. The glass doors of the Grand Pine Bank slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the polished marble interior where crystal chandeliers cast dancing reflections across gilded teller cages. A hush fell over the normally bustling lobby as all eyes turned toward the entrance. There, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, stood a figure that seemed displaced from time itself, an elderly raccoon whose silvered muzzle and stooped posture spoke of countless seasons weathered. His arrival disrupted the bank's carefully curated atmosphere of wealth and propriety. Where patrons typically glided across the floor in tailored suits and polished hooves, this visitor shuffled forward in worn leather boots that left faint traces of forest loam on the immaculate tiles. The tattered overcoat hanging from his narrow shoulders might have once been fine velvet, but now bore the muted tones of decades-old stains and inexpert repairs. Most conspicuous was the burlap sack clutched in his gnarled paws, its uneven bulges suggesting contents both heavy and irregular. Myra the rabbit felt her ears twitch involuntarily as the stranger approached her station. Up close, she noted how his whiskers quivered with each labored breath, how the claws protruding from his fingerless gloves had yellowed with age. The scent that followed him was an earthy melange of dried herbs, old paper, and something metallic she couldn't quite place. "I'm here to claim what's mine," he announced, his voice like dry leaves rustling across stone. The declaration hung in the air, momentarily silencing the usual murmur of financial transactions. Myra's practiced smile faltered only slightly. "Of course, sir. May I have your account number?" Her paws hovered over the ledger, ready to record his information. The raccoon's lips parted in an expression that might have been amusement, revealing teeth worn down but still formidable. "You misunderstand, little rabbit. I don't have an account." He leaned heavily on the counter, the burlap sack thumping against the polished wood. "I own this establishment." A titter rippled through the nearby patrons. At the next station, a dapper otter muffled a chuckle behind his glove. Even Myra felt the corners of her mouth twitch, until she met the old raccoon's gaze. One clouded eye stared milky and unseeing, but the other gleamed with unsettling intensity. The laughter died abruptly when Felix the fox materialized at Myra's elbow, his tailored waistcoat straining slightly over his ample midsection. "Is there some problem here?" he purred, though his vulpine eyes remained cold. Myra cleared her throat. "This gentleman believes he has ownership of the bank, sir." Felix's muzzle split into a wide grin, revealing perfectly polished teeth. "How absolutely quaint." He turned his full attention to the raccoon, towering over the smaller creature. "And what brings you to this remarkable conclusion, my aged friend?" Without breaking eye contact, the raccoon reached into his sack. The rustle of coarse fabric seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet lobby. When his paw emerged, it clutched an object that made Felix's ears perk forward in recognition, a tarnished brass key, its bow fashioned in the distinctive lobed shape of the bank's original insignia. "Where did you get that?" Felix's voice lost its playful edge, becoming sharp as a newly minted coin. The raccoon placed the key carefully on the counter, where it landed with a decisive clink. "Where it's been for the past 120 years, he rasped. Then, with deliberate movements, he appended the entire sack onto the marble surface. A cascade of yellowed parchment spilled forth, some rolls tied with crumbling ribbon, others folded into precise squares. A leather-bound ledger tumbled out, its spine cracking with the impact. The faint scent of mildew and old ink rose from the documents as they settled. At the very top lay a single sheet of vellum, its elaborate calligraphy still legible beneath the bank's original wax seal. Myra's paws trembled as she carefully unfolded the brittle paper. Her eyes widened as they traced the flowing script. Be it known by these presents that Elias Blackwood, founder and proprietor of the Grand Pine Monetary Institution, does hereby transfer all rights, titles, and interests in said establishment to one Raccoon, in perpetuity. The polished oak doors of the Grand Pine Bank swung inward with a groan of well-oiled hinges, admitting a shaft of afternoon sunlight that cut across the marble floor like a golden blade. The usual murmur of financial transactions faltered as patrons and tellers alike turned to regard the unusual figure silhouetted in the doorway. There, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick of knotted hickory, stood an elderly raccoon whose very presence seemed to disrupt the carefully curated atmosphere of wealth and propriety. His age showed in every movement, from the careful way he tested each step before committing his weight, to the deliberate manner in which his clouded eyes scanned the room. The faded greatcoat that hung from his narrow shoulders might have been fine velvet in some distant decade, but now bore the muted tones of countless seasons and improvised repairs. Most striking was the bulging burlap sack clutched in his left paw, its coarse fabric straining against mysterious angular contents. Myra the rabbit felt her ears twitch involuntarily as the stranger's shadow fell across her teller station. Up close, she could see how the fur around his muzzle had gone completely silver, how his claws, protruding from well-worn fingerless gloves, had yellowed and thickened with age. The scent that accompanied him was complex, dried herbs, old paper, and something metallic beneath it all that she couldn't quite identify. "I'm here to claim what's mine," he announced, his voice like parchment being slowly unfolded. The declaration hung in the air, momentarily silencing the usual clink of coins and rustle of banknotes. Myra's professional smile faltered only slightly as she smoothed her emerald waistcoat. "Of course, sir. May I have your account number?" Her paws hovered over the leather-bound ledger, ready to record his information. The raccoon's lips parted in what might have been amusement, revealing teeth worn down but still impressively intact. "You misunderstand, little rabbit." He leaned forward, the burlap sack thumping against the polished mahogany counter. "I don't have an account." His milky left eye stared blindly ahead while the right gleamed with unsettling clarity. "I own this establishment." A ripple of amusement spread through the nearby patrons. At the adjacent station, a dapper otter disguised his chuckle as a cough. Even Myra felt an involuntary twitch at the corner of her mouth, until she met that single piercing dark eye. There was something in its depths that made the fine hairs along her spine stand erect. The laughter died abruptly when Felix the fox materialized at her elbow, his tailored waistcoat straining slightly over his ample midsection. "Is there some problem here?" he purred, though his vulpine eyes remained cold as winter stones. Myra cleared her throat. "This gentleman believes he has ownership of the bank, sir." Felix's muzzle split into a wide grin that showed too many polished teeth. "How absolutely? Quaint." He turned his full attention to the raccoon, using his considerable height to loom over the smaller creature. "And what brings you to this remarkable conclusion, my aged friend?" Without breaking that unsettling one-eyed gaze, the raccoon reached into his sack. The rustle of coarse fabric seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed lobby. When his paw emerged, it held an object that made Felix's ears perk forward in recognition, a tarnished brass key, its bow fashioned in the distinctive lobed shape of the bank's original insignia. "Where did you get that?" Felix's voice lost its playful edge, becoming sharp as a newly minted coin. The raccoon placed the key carefully on the counter, where it landed with a decisive clink that echoed through the silent room. "Where it's been for the past 120 years, he rasped. Then, with the deliberate movements of one who has waited too long already, he appended the entire sack onto the marble surface. A cascade of ancient documents spilled forth, parchment scrolls tied with crumbling ribbon, folded legal papers with wax seals intact, a leather-bound ledger whose spine cracked audibly as it landed. The faint scent of mildew and old ink rose from the papers as they settled. Atop the pile lay a single sheet of vellum, its elaborate calligraphy still strikingly legible beneath the bank's original wax seal. Myra's paws trembled slightly as she carefully unfolded the brittle document. Her eyes widened as they traced the flowing script. Be it known by these presents that Elias Blackwood, founder and proprietor of the Grand Pine Monetary Institution, does hereby transfer all rights, titles, and interests in said establishment to one Raccoon, in perpetuity. The date beneath the signature made her breath catch, exactly 120 years ago to the day. A murmur spread through the gathered crowd as the implications settled over them like dust from the ancient pages. Felix's paw shot out to snatch the document, but the raccoon was faster, intercepting with a speed that belied his aged appearance. "Careful now," he chided, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Wouldn't want to damage the evidence, would we?" His claws, surprisingly sharp for one so old, tapped rhythmically against the counter as he fixed Felix with that unnerving single-eyed stare. The fox manager's tail bristled visibly as he turned to the nearest guard. "Fetch the archives master. Now." His usual composure showed cracks as he addressed the raccoon through gritted teeth. "Even if this document is genuine, which I highly doubt, there are statutes of limitation." "Ah, but you see," the raccoon interrupted, reaching into his coat pocket with deliberate slowness, "that's where you're mistaken." He produced a second document, this one bearing the seal of the High Court. The original charter specifically states that ownership persists in perpetuity, without limitation of time or generation. His whiskers twitched in something approaching amusement. "My lawyers were quite thorough." A commotion at the back of the lobby announced the arrival of the archives master, an ancient tortoise who moved with surprising haste given the circumstances. His spectacles fogged with exertion as he examined the proffered documents, his wrinkled face growing increasingly pale as he turned each page. When he finally looked up, his expression told the entire story before he spoke a word. Felix's ears flattened against his skull. "This is impossible," he hissed, though the tremor in his voice undermined the assertion. "The Blackwood family has owned this bank for generations." The raccoon's chuckle was dry as autumn leaves. "Bought it from my grandfather for a song during hard times," he corrected. "With a written promise to return it when the coons came calling." He tapped the court document meaningfully. "Which we have today." Myra watched in fascinated horror as Felix's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The fox's nostrils flared as he struggled to maintain control. "Even if this absurd claim holds water," he spat, "you can't possibly expect to just walk in here after a century and—" "Ah, but I haven't shown you the best part yet," the raccoon interrupted, his paw returning to the burlap sack. This time, what emerged was a small iron strong box, its surface pitted with age but the lock still gleaming. The tarnished key slid into the mechanism with satisfying precision, the click of the tumblers audible in the deathly quiet of the lobby. The contents of the box made even the tortoise archivist gasp. Neatly stacked bundles of bond papers, each bearing the bank's original letterhead and the signature of Elias Blackwood himself. The raccoon lifted one carefully, holding it up to the light. "Every loan, every mortgage, every financial instrument this institution ever issued," he explained calmly. "All payable to the bearer. All legally still outstanding." Felix's knees actually buckled, forcing him to grip the counter for support. The implications were staggering: every debt the bank had ever collected, every interest payment ever made, all potentially owed to this ragged creature standing before them. The raccoon's single good eye gleamed with quiet triumph as he surveyed the stunned faces around him. The air in the Grand Pine Bank grew thick enough to slice as the elderly raccoon's revelation settled over the assembled crowd. Behind the polished counters, tellers exchanged nervous glances, their carefully groomed ears twitching at the implications. The normally bustling lobby had fallen into a hush so complete that the ticking of the grand oak clock above the vault doors echoed like a hammer striking an anvil. Felix the Fox's carefully groomed tail bristled visibly beneath his tailored waistcoat as he stared at the ancient documents spread across his pristine counter. His claws dug into the polished mahogany surface, leaving faint scratches in the expensive finish. This is preposterous," he managed to sputter, though his voice lacked its usual commanding timbre. "These papers could be forgeries. They could be." The raccoon's gnarled paw, its claws yellowed but still sharp, tapped the notary seal on the primary document. The wax, though cracked with age, still showed the unmistakable imprint of the Grand Pine's founding insignia. "The archives master has already authenticated them," he said, his voice like dry leaves rustling across stone. "Unless you're suggesting your own institution's records are unreliable." A bead of sweat trickled down Felix's temple, dampening his perfectly coiffed fur. His eyes darted toward the ancient tortoise archivist, who merely shrugged his wrinkled shoulders in helpless confirmation. The fox's nostrils flared as he grasped for another argument. "Even if these documents are genuine, the statute of limitations does not apply," the raccoon interrupted smoothly, producing another parchment from his seemingly bottomless sack. This one bore the royal crest and was signed by the High Magistrate himself. The original charter specifically exempts ownership claims from temporal limitations. A rather clever clause, wouldn't you say? His milky eye remained unfocused while the good one gleamed with quiet triumph. Myra the rabbit found herself mesmerized by the unfolding drama. Her pink nose twitched as she caught the scent of something unexpected beneath the musty odor of old documents, a metallic tang that reminded her of the bank's vault. She watched as the raccoon's claws, surprisingly dexterous for their gnarled appearance, sorted through the papers with the precision of a master accountant. The tension shattered when a loud crash echoed from the vault corridor. One of Felix's junior managers, a weasel with overly ambitious aspirations, had been caught trying to remove safety deposit boxes. The raccoon didn't even turn toward the commotion. "Ah yes," he murmured, "I anticipated such enthusiasm." From his coat pocket he produced a small iron key, its teeth worn but still serviceable. "Shall we inspect my property together?" Felix's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "You can't just waltz in here and—" "Actually," the raccoon said, leaning forward until his muzzle was mere inches from the fox's, "that's precisely what I can do." His breath carried the scent of old forests and older secrets. "Unless you'd prefer I involve the constabulary, I'm certain they'd find the original vault blueprints quite interesting, especially the parts your predecessors modified." The blood drained from Felix's face so quickly Myra feared he might faint. The raccoon took advantage of the stunned silence to shuffle toward the vault entrance, his burlap sack swinging gently at his side. The gathered crowd parted before him like reeds before a slow but inevitable current. As the raccoon passed Myra's station, he paused and turned that unsettling one-eyed gaze upon her. Up close, she could see the intricate network of scars tracing patterns through his silvered fur, the marks of a life far more adventurous than his current appearance suggested. "You've been polite, little rabbit," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's a rare quality in financial institutions these days." With surprising gentleness, he pressed a single copper token into her paw, an ancient banknote from the institution's earliest days. "Keep this safe. It may be worth more than you expect." The walk to the vault took on the quality of a funeral procession. Felix trailed behind the Raccoon, his usual swagger reduced to a defeated shuffle. The junior staff whispered behind their paws, some already calculating how this seismic shift might benefit their own positions. The Raccoon moved with deliberate slowness, his claws clicking rhythmically against the marble floor as he took in every detail of his bank: the gilded moldings, the stained glass windows depicting financial allegories, even the portrait of Elias Blackwood that hung in the central hall. When they reached the massive vault door, a masterpiece of steel and intricate clockwork, the Raccoon didn't hesitate. His ancient key slid into the mechanism with a satisfying click. The gears groaned in protest after decades of disuse, but eventually yielded with a thunderous clank that shook dust from the ceiling. The scent that wafted out made every nose in the corridor twitch. Old parchment, yes, but beneath it something richer, something that made Felix's knees actually buckle. Gold. Not the neatly stacked ingots of modern banking, but coins and bars haphazardly piled as if dumped in haste. Chests overflowing with gemstones that caught the light and fractured it into rainbows across the walls. And most damning of all, ledger after ledger documenting every transaction the bank had ever made, including those it had conveniently forgotten to record in its official books. The Raccoon turned to face the assembled staff, his good eye reflecting the golden glow from within the vault. "It appears," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "we have much to discuss about the proper management of my property." His claws flexed slightly, catching the light like the blades of shears poised to cut through generations of deception. Felix opened his mouth to protest, but no sound emerged. The evidence, both financial and legal, was irrefutable. The Grand Pine Bank, cornerstone of the region's economy, pride of the Blackwood family for generations, belonged to a ragged old raccoon who smelled of the forest and carried his fortune in a burlap sack. And judging by the calculating glint in that single sharp eye, he had every intention of collecting what was owed with interest. The heavy vault door groaned shut with finality, sealing away the glittering hoard of gold and secrets. The Raccoon turned slowly, his burlap sack now bulging with select ledgers and a few choice coins, not for their value, but as evidence. The bank staff stood frozen in various attitudes of shock, their carefully maintained facades of professionalism shattered like the wax seals on the ancient documents. Felix the Fox had crumpled into an ornate chair, his tail limp, his normally immaculate fur disheveled. His claws absently traced the carvings on the armrests, the Blackwood family crest that would need to be chiseled away come morning. The junior managers had already begun the subtle dance of shifting allegiances, their postures subtly reorienting toward their new master. Myra the rabbit clutched the copper token in her paw, feeling the raised lettering beneath her fingertips. The Raccoon caught her eye as he passed, his expression unreadable. "The interesting thing about banks," he murmured, just for her ears, "is how quickly fortunes change." His whiskers twitched. "I'll need competent staff who understand that." Outside, the setting sun painted the bank's facade in hues of fire and gold. The Raccoon paused on the steps, breathing in the crisp evening air. From his coat pocket, he produced a small, withered acorn, the last gift from his grandfather before the bank changed hands all those years ago. He pressed it into the cracks between the cobblestones, where perhaps one day it might take root. The sack over his shoulder clinked softly as he walked away, leaving behind the whispers and chaos of the Grand Pine Bank. Somewhere in the gathering twilight, an owl called, the sound like coins dropping into an endless vault. The old Raccoon smiled, knowing this was just the first of many long overdue reckonings.